Welcome. This is so awesome. We're always, we never know when we put on programs, are we going to have 5 or if we're going to have 65 or whatever. There's a lot of events and programs and stuff going on, so thank you for joining us for our program tonight. So we're going to talk about Bonanza Farms and especially this one that was near Hancock. But a few housekeeping things first. I want to recognize any of our board members that are here. You maybe were greeted by Karen DeVita in the white blouse. She's our board president right now. There she is. She's originally from Hancock, but we determined that she moved up in the world. She lives by Chicago now. And then where she's going next, we don't know. She thought a cemetery, but no. Anyway, and so Jeannie Ennin is our county commissioner liaison on our board. And Marianne Nelson is our newest member. She lives near Alberta. We're so thankful that our trusty Alberta member is now on our board. And George, he's a good helper here. Dave Wolf's over here. You guys from Hancock know Dave Wolf, and he's on our board. And Richard Olson, yeah. It doesn't help when some have caps on. Okay, Richard Olson from Donnelly area is on our board as well. Did I miss anyone? Bill Erickson back there, he's doing sound, and he is going to video this so that it'll eventually get on our YouTube channel, because some people had to go to a concert or whatever tonight. He is our collections manager. We are thrilled at all the many talents and abilities that came with him when he came to the museum. From the radio station, he's knowledgeable about so many things that I am not. Which is technology and video and all of that. It's awesome to have him on our staff. I'm Cam Erickson, and I've been the director here about 4.5 years. I am not from Stevens County, so everything I know about Stevens County, I learned by researching. So that's why this presents a great opportunity for me to learn more about the county when there's a specific location or a specific topic to research, and then when I'm able to share it with someone, as you know, when you teach something, it goes into your long-term memory and you have a little better chance of remembering it down the road for a little ways anyway. So I do not claim to be the best public speaker in the world, but I wanted this chance to do the research and to learn and to share this because it's such an intriguing story. And also, if you're not familiar with our building, the bathrooms are downstairs. You can take the stairway or the elevator to get to the lower level. There's lemonade and cookies over there. You can feel free in the middle of the presentation if you feel like you need a snack to go get one. Not a problem at all. So there have been many knowledgeable historians and researchers that preceded me by a long shot. So I just first of all want to give shout out to all the people that when I was kind of putting this together. This is our file on the bull farm, by the way. This is a lot of information to go through. And so my goal was to get it down to something that's just kind of like the main thing and to kind of take you along on a timeline journey of this place and not get into it any more than you need, really. So part of this is from Edna Mae Bush. Some of you probably have this book at home that Edna Mae Bush put out in 1976. And it's a valuable resource every day here. We have 2 guys, Bert Ahern and Stashenko Hempek. back in 1976, they were university students and did a research project on the place and people that we're going to talk about. So, I mean, it's like a lot of information to glean through. Another person that used to work here is Tammy Plank, and some of you probably knew or know Tammy Plank. She was a researcher here on staff years ago. She did an article about the bull farm in the Senior Perspective magazine in 2006. So, another place to glean. And then we have the 125th history or anniversary book that Hancock put out that also has a bull farm story in it. And then we have this lady named, maybe some of you know, Ina Wevley. Does that ring a bell for anyone? Ina Wevley did her research about the bull farm. So the plat book, the Stevens County plat book helps. There's just a lot of stuff here, and so what I attempted to do is just kind of make it concise and bring the highlights into an order. It's hard to believe that 1 year ago, we put in the Story of Stevens County exhibit. Some of you were here when it was brand new for the opening reception we had, and that was exactly a year ago. And so when we put that in, one of our goals was to listen to people like you when you come in to see it, and listen to your questions, like which parts do people want to know more about? Because obviously in there, it's just like a little snippet about a lot of things, but it's not a lot about any one thing. So our goal was whatever is in there that people are the most intrigued about, we'll take that, get more information, and then have one of these kind of programs. Probably more than anything else, people ask about the very blurry photo in there, because we don't have like pristine photos from the late 1800s. We do the best we can. But there's a photo in there of the house that was on the bull farm, or we should say mansion, really. And it shows up in there, and people are like, where is this? Is it still there? Where was this? I mean, there's been more questions about that than any other thing in there. So that's kind of why we decided this would be a great topic. And then it just kind of worked to do a two-part Bonanza Farm with the Barrett Ranch and this one back-to-back months. So that's kind of how that transpired. So there's a lot of questions even that I had. And if you've ever done research or dug into your family history, you might have these 3 questions and you do research and you get the answer for those, but now you have 3 new questions because you found out some other things, and now you have 3 new questions and you don't know the answer for those. So that kind of happened with this as well. So we're going to answer some of the questions, but we might actually end up with a couple more at the end that we don't necessarily know the answer for, but that's all right. That keeps us seeking and trying to learn more. So this this farm that we're going to talk about is by no means the only Bonanza farm that was in Stevens County. And it really wasn't the only large farm in Hodges Township where this ends up. So we're going to talk a little bit more about like even what a Bonanza farm is. But there's a reason that this one kind of stayed in our history as a little more popular than some of the others. And I think you'll kind of see why as we go along. But before we get into this, we kind of have to lay a little groundwork on like, why would somebody in the 1800s want to farm thousands of acres? Why would you want to do that? So we're going to start there. So after the Civil War, we know that there was a lot of expansion in Minnesota and all across the country. And one of the big reasons was the railroad. And the railroad increased movement of goods exponentially. And railroads were laid down. And that's how our towns began. They'd lay them down and they'd decide, like, they'd plot out the towns, and later they'd get a name and whatnot. There's big growth in agriculture as well. So why was there big growth in agriculture? Well, of course, because of the modern machinery. This was modern machinery in that time because it was a steel plow. And we have one over here in our exhibit. And so, man, you can do a lot with that. I mean, that's a really strange concept right now when we see all the huge combines that rolling through our fields with 12 rows and whatever, that at one time this was modern machinery. Access to cheap land was another expansion, something that promoted expansion. So if you got a homestead, you could improve your 160 acres for 5 years and get your deed, or you could buy it for $1.25 an acre right away. But if you got 3,000 or more acres, you could get a sale price for $1 an acre. You get 25 cents off. Horses. In 1850, Minnesota only had 874 horses, but 30 years later, there was just a few more. And another large agriculture expansion was the flour milling in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And for about 50 years, they were considered the flour capital of the world. And the single greatest phenomena that contributed to that was the creation of the Bonanza Farm. So how did that happen? Well, there were business people that would advertise on the East Coast, like in New York, and a lot of people that came here were like from Pennsylvania, then they go to Iowa, then they come this way. So they would just tell them, like in newspapers and word of mouth and whatever, how rich the soil was and how much money you could make. And investors thought, well, if you can make a small amount of money on a small amount of land, you should be able to make a large amount of money on a large piece of land. So these investors thought, let's give it a go. So of course we know that there was land, rail, machinery. The grain prices were pretty high because of all the flour milling. But these investors were not farmers. Most of them made a lot of money in other industries like real estate or the flour mill or lumber or sawmills. So they already had a lot of money. They didn't think it was important to know anything about farming. And sometimes they would just kind of convince their buddies to kind of like join in with them. It's like misery loves company, right? If I'm going to go down, I might as well go down with someone else too. But so it was a big risk for them. But if you have a lot of money, it's like, well, I've tried these other 5 things. I might as well try this too. So a Bonanza farm was considered 1,000 acres at first, but then later on, as there were more of them, then it was, you know how the ante is always upped a little bit? Then it was 3,000 if you wanted to be considered a Bonanza farmer. So these investors were from the city. So was there anyone in here who was on the Wrensville Township bus tour? Okay. So we talked about Ignatius Donnelly, who was also a Bonanza farmer in Wrensville Township. He just got a buddy to go manage his farm for him. And that's what a lot of these investors did. they would just convince one of their buddies. Well, their buddies were just like them. They didn't know what they were doing. So they would, as you'll see, that really didn't work out so well. So they would hire these managers, and they'd invest all over the place. There were places they didn't even visit. They didn't even really know where it was. They owned the land. They hired someone to go there and run the farm, and they maybe never even went there. And they certainly, usually, didn't live there. They wanted to stay in the city. So, so they would have a manager over the whole thing, and then because it was such a large plot of land, they would break it down, like maybe there would be a superintendent over a section, and then they'd break down the section, and then there'd be like 4 or 5 foremen that would take on another division. So there was a lot of layers of management. So the main farmstead, there would always have to be like the main farm site. They would end up being like small cities because they had so many employees, and they had machinery, and they had animals, and they had to have a blacksmith shop and a creamery and an elevator. So they would eventually just become like a little city. They had a lot of employees, and actually doing the farm work, sometimes if there's a little story in our exhibit on the timeline about the hobos that used to jump off the trains. Some of those hobos would end up on these Bonanza Farms, and they were actually like, they were doing the hard labor. So they could hop on a train in the cities, and they just hop off somewhere, and if they needed some work, because they needed to, or they just wanted to eat or whatever, they could usually get a job on these farms. So Bonanza farming was just like a distinct era, and it was about 15 to 20 years. And it probably was a little longer of an era in North Dakota than it was here. Because North Dakota had more Bonanza farms and larger ones than we did in Minnesota. But it is said, now when I say it is said, sometimes it is said in here, which I am finding out that a lot of that is from a newspaper. Like from our Stevens County, well, they had different names, but a lot of that's gleaned out of the newspapers. So it was said in the newspaper that in 1880, Stevens County had more large tracts of land owned by individuals than any other county in Minnesota. However, it also says that near Wilmer, there was a guy named John Camp who had 33,000 acres. I can't even imagine at that time farming that much land. That's a lot. By the mid and late 1890s, a lot of these were sold and divided and broken up, and we'll see more about that later. So now we're in 1876, and Hancock is 4 years old. They got the name Hancock. They incorporated in 1872, and they are 4 years old. And here comes Ezra Farnsworth from New York and Charles Newcomb from Minneapolis. These wealthy people somehow would find each other. They wanted to invest. They run into L.B. Hodges, who was a state senator, but he also planted trees for the railroad. And he probably planted trees up here at some point. And he probably thought, man, it's a pretty nice looking place up here. So he told these two guys, you should go Bonanza Farm up by Hancock. So they did. And they purchased sections 11, 13, 15, and 23 in Hodges Township. And they decide that section 23 is going to be their main farm site. So they purchased the yellow part, and right there is where they decide their main farm's gonna be. So if you know the area, here we have Hancock is like the northern part of the town here. Page Lake, so it's pretty close to Page Lake. So they decide to design a house. And this house is described as the finest house west of the Mississippi. It cost them $20,000, which translates to over $500,000. But when you see the house, you'll realize it would cost way more than that to build it today. So there's 60 rooms. There's a bell in every room so they can call servants. High ceilings. It said this main staircase is 4 horses wide. The third floor is a wide open ballroom so they can have social gatherings and dances. And they also built 2 large barns on the site. So there it is. That's what they built. So why in the world, especially when they're not going to live there, why would you want to build it so big? I mean, what is the purpose? Well, part of what they wanted to do was attract other people to come here and kind of join in what they're doing, and more people like them. And a lot of people that were investors did this. And so this is the front page of the, just a minute here. At the time, the Morris newspaper was called The Sun, or just like, that was it. And so this is the first courthouse, Stevens County Courthouse. Here's the mansion they built. Here's the school. And here we know it as Ewell's. But it wasn't Ewell's at this time. This is like in 1885, I think it was. But this is the building we know as Ewell's. And so they would take what they thought were the most prestigious buildings in the county, put them on the paper, and then everything on this front around here is trying to get people to come here. And I wish I could read it all to you. It's very amusing. But there's like, they would use, if any of you have ever read old newspapers, the language they use is amusing and hilarious. Very forthright. They didn't, it wasn't about like, we don't care if we offend anyone or not. It's just like all out there. But the flowery language is so great. So this is a paragraph from this page. No county so admirably located as is Stevens, inhabited by so thorough and aggressively energetic people, can fail to catch glimpses in the vista of not far distant ages of the glorious dawn of metropolitan affluence. So like, that's how this whole page is written. So they're really, really, people are gonna go, oh my gosh, look at this. We gotta go check this out. We gotta move there. That's where we should buy land. So the picture on this paper is called a lithograph. And so, just to kind of blow it up so you can see it better, that's the lithograph drawing from the newspaper. But one of the things, and we know they built some more buildings too, but if you look over here, to me, in this little skyline, it almost looks very metro. Like, what is this over here? I'm kind of like, did they like want to give an illusion that this was on the edge of like a large city or something? Because this looks like almost like little skyscrapers back here in the tree line. You got to look close, but it's kind of misleading. But they didn't care. That was the whole idea. So Farnsworth and Newcomb. The manager that they chose was poor. Not a good, didn't manage the land. The business failed. And here they built that big mansion and the barns and everything. 6 years total, they're done. They sell it. 6 years. It's like, wow. I mean, that's hard to believe. But right about that time, these three guys establish a corporation called the Minnesota Farming and Lumber Association. And that's what a lot of these large investors would do. They would form a corporation together and conveniently make themselves the officers. So we have, the reason I have this guy's name in parentheses is like some places it says Beard and some it says Baird. So seems like there's a discrepancy there. But so these three guys, and I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Charles Giddings, the name Charles Giddings if you're from Hancock. But that's kind of unusual actually, that one of these investors is a local person, because usually they're all from the city. So they grabbed in someone local into their association, and they buy what is now, at this time, it's called the Moreland Farm for $42,100. Now, we have no idea why it's referred to as the Moreland Farm every so often in all of the research. And I had other researchers, and like, can you see if you can find out why it's called that? Have no idea. No person associated with it is by that name, and nobody knows why they refer to it as that. But sometimes in the newspapers, it is referred to as the Big Farm or the Hancock Farm. So there are a few names, but the Moreland Farm is one of them, and it doesn't really make sense. But anyway, this guy Snyder here, he also purchases almost all of Baker Township personally. So like, these guys are running land as a association, but they also buy land personally. So they run it as a stock farm. And Mr. Beard purchases $27,000. That's a lot of money at that time. That's more than the house cost of purebred shorthorn cattle, and later a really expensive breed of jerseys. Anyway, the manager that they got, he thought like, oh my gosh, keeping those cattle separate, that is just so much work. We'll just let them run together. Dave, I bet you're just like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Right? He lets them run together, and pretty soon they're worth nothing. They're not purebred anything anymore, right? So they're just worth nothing. He doesn't know what he's doing. And Beard decides to switch to horses, and that fails, and the crops fail. But somehow, just in 2 years, these guys own this 2 years, they increase their land by 3 more sections in Moore Township, another section in Hodges, and pretty soon it's 4,920 acres. And here is their stock report of what they have on their farm. So even though they really didn't know what they were doing, they sure invested, and they sure grew their operation. But these guys bought it in 1882, and they sell it 2 years later. Because this company, the Minnesota Agriculture Company, is established by our new friend, Benjamin Bull, his son-in-law, Louis Menage, and this other guy from Minneapolis. So they form that. They assume the mortgage from the other association, and they purchase the Moreland Farm but we know it soon becomes the bull farm, and now we know why. Because this guy right here, little more about him. He's from New York. He had to leave home at 12 because his family couldn't afford to feed him anymore. It's like, you need to go, right? Because you got 8 brothers and sisters behind you. We got more mouths to feed. You're already 12. So he basically was pushed out. His dad said, you got to go. And he started supporting himself, and he's just kind of like a self-made entrepreneur. So he goes to Minneapolis via a lot of other places, and he gets into the grocery industry, the flour milling, lumber yards and whatnot. Everything he did, he always had a really good partner or two, and he was very careful on his partners. He got married and had a daughter. His wife died soon, and then he remarried Beulah down here on the bottom corner. Some of his notable things was he was in the group that started the first street railway system in Minneapolis. And his group owned the Humboldt Mill, but when Washington Mills had their big explosion in their flour mill, it also exploded mills that were nearby. So his mill exploded as a result of a Washington Mills explosion. So he just decided he's done in the flour milling. He's gonna go into bonanza farming with his son-in-law. Some other things that were noted about him in our famous yellow book: he was energetic, he understands stock, he like livestock, practical manager, personal attention to detail, and people liked him. So now we can kind of see like why the farm starts taking on his name. Lewis is wealthy, and he is a huge businessman. He has a loan company, a realty company, and he's investing all over the world. And he married Benjamin Bull's daughter. So these 3 guys that have this company purchased 14,000 acres all over Minnesota and North Dakota. But for some reason, you know, most owners don't live on their bonanza farm. But Benjamin and Beulah, for some reason, they just really liked the Hancock area, and they probably really liked that mansion. I mean, who wouldn't want to live there, right? Especially if they want to throw big parties and they have that big ballroom up there, and they can really impress people in this area, and they must love it here. So they hold social parties, and it says that they just really added a lot of activity to the Hancock area when they lived here. And they got to be known as Lord and Lady Bull. So that tells you something about what everyone thought of them. But here's a list of what they added to the main farm site: a boarding house, a dairyman house, creamery, water tank, windmill, machine sheds, feed mill, a granary that held 50,000 bushel of wheat, 6 large barns, and they also put in tunnels so you could get from the house to the barns through tunnels. And the barns had such a sophisticated ventilation system, the water never froze in the barns for the animals. So that was some unique designing there. So here is a photo that we have. We don't know there isn't a year, but because of what it says around the outside, we can be pretty certain that it belongs with this particular group, because up there it says Minnesota Agricultural Companies Stock and Dairy Farm, Hancock, Minnesota. And then down here it says, show herd of purebred shorthorns starting for fair. So that would be during this era where Mr. Bull and his partners own it. So that's a good picture of part of the farm. So everything seems to be going smashingly for this group, right? I mean, they're socialites, they're adding fun to Hancock, they are well liked, the farm is growing, it's its own city, and I mean, what could go wrong? Well, Benjamin dies. So he and Beulah had only been living there for 5 years. And it says, you know, it's like paralysis. You know, sometimes at this time, when you read the newspaper on why they died, it's kind of like, well, if it was this, it was probably caused by what we can now call a stroke. So by the description, it seemed like he probably had a stroke. He was only 57. So if you remember all of his qualities about being a good manager, and you know, you start thinking like, oh my gosh, now what's going to happen to this place, right? The guy that was the glue holding this together has just died. And his wife moves back to Minneapolis, where she lives the rest of her life, outliving 4 children. And it isn't long after that, the guarantee loan company that his son-in-law owned collapses, and all of a sudden, the law is chasing him south because he has questionable financial dealings, and he's just like on the run, and detectives follow him to Guatemala in South America and never find him. So like, there we go. There's the secretary treasurer. That's what he was doing. And pretty soon, this company that they formed is insolvent. It is under, and the farm is probably, you know how a lot of times if everybody likes the main manager and he's not there anymore and they leave, and then who knows, they probably got someone else in there and they didn't know what they were doing. And everything's collapsing, and the land is divided and sold off into bankruptcy. And here's a little clip from the newspaper. On October 31st, 1895, a large colony of settlers from Illinois are negotiating for lands in the vicinity of Hancock, and it is probable the old Bull Farm will be parceled out in quarter-section tracts. This will be a good benefit to the south part of the county and demonstrates that ere long the big unprofitable tracts will be divided up, increasing both population, trade, and production to the county. So there was a lot of thoughts about these farms because most people were, you know, it kept a lot of other people from coming in to the community and bringing more people in to do business in town. There was even an article in the Hancock Record. There's some more modern machinery over there. Here's a little excerpt they wrote called Fool's Farming. Condition of affairs that has retarded our growth. Why Hancock now grows. With common sense methods, we must push ahead. The several large farms in the neighborhood of Hancock were failures nearly every time and proved white elephant on the hands of the proprietors of the farms. It was no fault of the land, as small farms on either side of them have proven highly satisfactory to their owners and have never been other than good investments. The failure of these large farms has helped create the impression that the land was of no account and in great measure to blame. This idea is totally wrong and is one of the main causes for the lack of growth, and it's enough to kill almost any town, no matter how enterprising their citizens are. However, it is very evident that this Hancock record did not reach Blue Earth, Minnesota. Because we have a guy from George Rico that moves here now from Blue Earth, and he decides he's gonna try Bonanza farming here. It's much smaller, it's down to 1,280 acres now, and a number of the buildings had burned by 1899. So he probably thought it's a little more manageable. And in the ballroom, he decided that children could come and ride their bicycles and roller skate up there and forget the dances. And he decides that he doesn't want that whole mansion, so he decides to cut off various parts of this house and sell them. In fact, it's in our research that 2 complete houses went to Hancock, to town, from this mansion. So I talked with Margaret Mesner Cunningham, because she would have grown up across the street. Anyway, she was pretty sure that one of these houses was her grandma's house at one time, but she said it's not there anymore. And she didn't think the other house was anywhere either, because these would be very, very old. Also, Henry Doesdall, that name might ring a bell. How is that related to you, John? Do you know? Your grandfather? How cool is this? Here we're talking about your grandpa and you're right here. So it says, Edna Mae Bush says, so it must have been in a newspaper, that your grandpa bought the creamery. Does that sound like some? So where do you think he moved the creamery to? Like his place or to town or? To his place. Okay. And then also part of the house went over to the Mesner farm, but I think there were multiple Mesner farms, so I'm not sure which one. But anyway, it gets parceled out, broken up. But it's still a large 3-story farmhouse that we'll see in a minute here. And after just a couple years, like literally just a couple years, this family sells the farm and goes back to Blue Earth. But we have 3 graves on this place by the early 1900s. There's a little gap right here after George Rico leaves. There's a little gap of information on exactly what was going on for a little bit yet. But we know that when George Rico's family was there, their 9-year-old daughter died. And by the description, it would have been probably strep throat. Like complications when strep goes too far untreated, just from the description. And she is buried. Like we have an obituary about her, but they buried her right there in what they call the plum grove, which is a grove of plum trees that's kind of by the driveway. Some years later, when her brothers, she had 2 brothers, when they were adults, they came back and put a gravestone on their sister's grave. But there's also this other one that, this is one of the new questions. I didn't know about this until doing the research, and now this is like, who are these people? So there is this gravestone right next to her gravestone in the plum grove. that says at rest, Keller babies, born December 27th, 1907, and they died the same day, and they're twins. And they're right there next to her. So I looked up Keller in our index, and there's a lot of them. So that's a whole nother project to see who that is all there. But there is also throughout the research that there is a third grave in the plum grove, and it is a mystery man that died or was killed in a brawl that took place during one of the dance parties that were out at the mansion there, one of the social gatherings, and they buried him in the plum grove, and then they came back and just resumed the party. So we don't know a name or anything. But if this was during a party, we know this would have been during the Benjamin and Beulah Bowl era. They probably had no idea what was going on. Can you imagine having a party and a few days later you're out in your plum grove and you're like, what's that? You know, you would have seen like some fresh dirt that was dug up and you had no idea what this was about right here. That would be a little frightening. It's like, it's about the shape of a body, right? And you'd be like, okay.
Where is that plum grove? Does it still?
So there is that. So Ed Kenyon lives there now, and I called him Ed Kenyon. And we'll get to that. We're a little ahead of ourselves there. But the plum grove is a little grove of trees to the left of the driveway. And I think it's smaller now than it used to be, but it's still there. I would have taken a picture, but we have a little snow right now. So that kind of deterred that. So like I said, we have a little gap of what we know about this place for about 20 years. But in my office on the wall, I have this great map that is from 1927. And when I looked on section 23 in 1927, John Erickson owns this half of the section where this place is. And this makes total sense because is Theora here? No, okay. Do any of you know Theora Verseg? So she came last week, brought us some photos that we used, and it was so awesome just to ask her some questions and stuff, because yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. But the photos that she brought in, I asked her, like, where did you get these? And she said, Bud Frisbee gave them to me. And at first I'm like, why would Bud Frisbee have anything to do with, why would he have these photos? His grandpa owned the land, and he probably went down the family and, you know, went from him to the son and to the grandson, and then, you know, it just kept going down. So it kind of made sense that he might have those photos. So from the 30s to the 80s, this is also verified by Theora last week. It was owned by the descendants of John Erickson's family. And there was a lot of Versteeg families that lived there through those years, and they were all renting, including Theora and Nick, rented. They lived there from 1966 to 1986, so for about 20 years. So these are pictures that she brought us. This top corner one is from like 1970. These other two are like from the 50s. So it's like the same house, just from a side view and a front view. So what they did when they whittled the big mansion down to this part of the house, it's this back part right here. Like, they left the back part and then just closed it in. And it just looks like, it just looks like a very typical house that you would see on a farm, big farmhouse. One of the other things Theora said was that she remembers in the basement, there were many archways that were concreted in, like arched doorways that were concreted over, which would insinuate where you would go through remember the tunnels? Where you would go into the tunnel and then they closed them in. So in 1985, the rest of that house burnt. And then a custom home was moved onto the site. And then Ed Kenyon and his wife purchased like the building site, which is like 17 acres. And they've lived there ever since. So I called Ed and I said, I had driven out there and I saw a little shed and I'm like, oh, I wanted that little shed to be original so bad. I said, are there any original buildings still left? And he said, yeah, there was a barn until last May 12th when we all lost trees and buildings and things. And now it's just a pile of sticks. And that was the last original building. It just went down this last May, which is really sad. And this is another picture that Theora brought in. It's more like the front, but it's nice and clear. There's some people on there, but we don't know who the people are exactly. But it was quite a house.